Right, so this is Agroforestry, Fabulous Farmers. I'm Steve Newman. I'm not fabulous, I'm just old and ugly, really, but anyway, we'll press on. Agroforestry, in simple terms, that means farming with trees in a way that's thought out, mixing it with crops or animals. I've been doing temperate agroforestry for about 35 years now, mainly in the UK, but also in China and India and the Iberian Peninsula. So I made an incredible number of mistakes. And that's easy to do with trees. They look simple things, but I can assure you that they can be problematic. So I'm going to hand over now to Ben, and he's going to tell you a bit more about these wonderful, fabulous farms.
Thanks, Steve. Yes, I'm Ben Raskin, and I am fabulous. I'm just going to, as well as introduce myself, I'm going to tell you about the Fabulous Farmers Programme. So Fabulous, FAB stands for Functional Agricultural Biodiversity. So things like rotations and cover crops, herbal lays, organic matter, and agroforestry. And it's an Interreg funded project, so it's helping to organise the session today. You've got a sheet on your seat, say that the right way around. So if you're interested in finding out more about the programme, there's some learning networks that we're supporting in the southwest of England and in Wales around agroforestry. There's a Facebook Agroforestry UK page. So if you want to sign up to the Fab Farmers programme, then just fill that in and either leave it on your chair or hand it to me at the end, or to Lucy, who's waving her hand in the middle. So that's the programme. I am the head of horticulture and agroforestry at the Soil Association. I was also editor of the Agroforestry Handbook, which both Steves contributed to. And I'm also running a 200-acre agroforestry project in Wiltshire, near Swindon. So it's a silver pastoral system where, like Steve, we've made lots of mistakes, which I'll be talking about. Yeah, that's me. Over to you, Steve.
Hopefully that's working. Yeah, good. It's like some shabby boyzone band here at the moment.
We're not shabby, how dare you?
Stephen Briggs. I'm a farmer from Cambridgeshire. I'm a tenant, first-generation farmer. We've got 125 acres of agroforestry, silver arable, growing cereals and fruit crops, which we put in 2009. So we're 13 years into that now. I'm also a Nuffield Farming Scholar. Did a Nuffield Farming Scholarship back in 2009-10, looking at agroforestry globally, right around the world. So I spend my life... Come on through.
Fabulous.
Spaniels, they run faster than they can think. I spend most of my time either farming at home or providing advice to farmers on developing their agricultural systems. I'm also head of soils for Innovation for Agriculture. So I've done a fair bit of work on policy, helping form the European Agroforestry Federation back in 2011, which was an interesting experience. Developed over too many bottles of wine in a Paris restaurant, but that's a whole other story. So we'll look forward to sharing some of our experiences and mistakes about actually practically farming and developing agroforestry systems on our own properties, but also maybe experiences from other farms as well. So I'll hand over to Harriet.
Hi, I'm Harriet Bell, and I'm largely up here today because of the work I did at the Dartington estate. So there's quite a plethora of agroforestry projects there, but I established a trial silver arable site and then also a silver pastoral site on the estate. However, for my sins, I'm currently running a DEFRA test and trial for the Dartmoor National Park, looking at land management plans.
So some housekeeping notes. If there's a fire, you can run anywhere you want. The second thing is, if anybody's on the run from the police or worried about having a photograph taken, they will be taking photographs later. Is that right? Yeah.
During the session. So yeah, if you don't want your photograph taken, then let us know.
Yeah. Okay. So so we're going to start with different. While dividing things into themes, we've got selecting the right tree, planting and management for survival, harvesting and marketing, ownership and tenancy challenges or government policy mistakes. But we'll also should have time for any other things that crop up that you want to learn about. So selecting the right tree, well, bear in mind that there's lots of different things. It doesn't have to be a timber tree, and also remember that even our so-called English apple was a forest tree in Central Asia, and it used to like living with walnuts. So we've got fruit and nut trees. So who's going to be running this one?
I think I'm diving in as the first example of someone that's killed
So
lots
if anybody
of trees.
wants to know anything about selecting the right trees, please ask your questions to Harriet now.
Well, no, I think we're diving in first to talk about our experiences, and then if anybody has any questions, please raise your hands.
All right.
I mean, so essentially from my experience, I worked on a farm that planted a lot of apple trees, cider apple trees predominantly, because that's what was funded through HLS. The learning from that experience is that the money is terrible, and they cost a lot to establish, and that if you were looking at it from a non-stewardship perspective, you were looking at it from a farm business perspective, you wouldn't necessarily look just at kind of the environmental outcomes. So when it came to our silver pastoral trial at Dartington, we did it in reverse. We actually went out to look for the market. We were like, who's buying tree crops, and what are they buying, and what do they want, and what does the market demand? And that's actually how we identified which crops we were going to grow. Through that research, we found people that had specific demands, specific quantities or qualities that they wanted, and we endeavoured to design a system that delivered that outcome for them, or will deliver that outcome for them in the future. It's still quite a young system, so I'd really look at the market kind of perspective. And the other thing we did is we sort of spread the risk of our field. So we picked a variety of different trees. We tried to put them in the place that best suited them. But for example, one of the things we did is look at a novel agroforestry crop. So we looked at Szechuan pepper, but because it was novel, hadn't been grown at scale in the UK before, we made that a smaller part of our field. So we did try something different. We tried something new, but we tried to kind of balance risk in our tree selection between known staples like elderflower and apple, which we knew grow quite well in Devon, and then introducing something new, and that helped us kind of spread our risk. And then for our silver pastoral crop, when we were kind of setting up our trial site, we looked at the animals we had, the livestock we had, their behaviour and dietary needs, and we had goats and cows to kind of play with, and they're actually quite different in terms of what they might want in terms of mineral nutritional intake from leaves, but also things like their reach, their ability to get through tree guards, so taking those things into consideration. And then we also looked at the particular field in question, in terms of selecting the right tree for that field. So we decided to, I don't know if all farmers have this, but our medicine paddock, that was the field we decided to go first in with silver pastoral systems. It's right at the front of the farm. It sets a nice tone for the kind of farming system you're running, but it's also where you put the animals that you need to keep your eye on because they've got mastitis, they're feeling a bit poorly, they're about to calve. And so we particularly then looked at medicinal trees in that space. And then the design and the layout that would enable you to see kind of clearly throughout the whole field, particularly if you're trying to keep an eye on kind of poorly animals, so that you don't have to kind of go in and search the whole time. So if you were doing a different field, you probably go for different trees, different planting selections, but that's the kind of thing that motivated our choice. I hope I haven't spoken too quickly, and that you managed to catch that. And are we opening up to questions, or does anyone else want to dive in? Are there any questions straight off the bat about selecting the right tree? One at the back, yes. How do you find the markets? Does anyone else want to dive in on this one? I mean, I literally just thought about things I ate and drank that were made from trees and called those people and asked them if they wanted to buy stuff, which included reading an article in The Guardian that said this is going to be a big deal. And I was just like, called them up. I was like, oh, if I grew this, do you want to buy it? And they said yes.
So with Dartington,
Yeah.
the markets were an ice cream manufacturer.
So we've got Raskin Drinks,
Yeah.
which is a local soft fruit drinks company who were kind of new, and I drank their drinks. We've got one of our neighbouring farms who was selling into a veg box, a fruit and veg bag, and then at the farmers market, so we knew that they already sold crops. And then Szechuan pepper was the one I read an article in a newspaper about. I was like, oh, I'll try growing that. Just gave him a call. Steve, did you want to pick up the topic?
Yeah, so I mean, from our own perspective, if we're talking about selecting the right tree, I'll cover it a bit later on, but as a tenant, putting a tree in, that's a pretty long-term project. So we needed to make sure that we got an economic return within the the 15 years of our farm business tenancy. So whilst I had aspirations for maybe oak trees or walnut trees, we weren't going to be there long enough to maybe realise the economic outcome from those trees. So we actually went 100% apples, and the reason we went apples, even though it was 13 different varieties, some heritage, some modern, was because I could get an economic return within the 15 years of our tenancy by doing something with that productive fruit within that period. Secondly, at the time, thinking back to 2009, 2008, 9, when we put these in, we also needed to make sure that we retained basic payment scheme eligibility. We'll talk about that later on with policy, but fruit trees were an eligible crop for BPS, and that was an important consideration as far as my landlord was concerned. So that took us down that route, and from day one, or from day -1, we were always interested in trying to leverage marketplaces and add value. So we already had an eye on value added. So all our fruit is either sold as retail for eating apples, or it's now all juiced and sold retail as an apple juice, which we sell ourselves to our own farm shop. Initially, we were selling some to a Suffolk cider producer, and as we well know, cider is a fruit-based product that's part of your 5 a day. At least it will be later. That was our initial strategy, just to get things going. But it was always with an eye of, in answer to the lady's question, where's the market? Well, actually, we wanted to create a market. So we've actually had to go out and get some processing capacity and actually create a brand and a market for that produce, which when you've got sort of 20 tons of apples is tiny to a cider producer, but it's quite a lump of fruit to do something with in sort of in a year.
Can I?
So for me, all the trees were 2-year-olds, and that's a massive consideration in terms of so selecting the right tree. Well, actually, it's got to be right for the soil type, it's got to be right for the local environment, and you've got to be able to go and buy the planting stock, and that's going to become an increasing challenge. Is the planting? Government's got some great targets for tree planting, but where's all the planting material going to come from? One of the other reasons we picked fruit, actually, I should mention, is that there is fruit in the vicinity, but nothing in our immediate area, which meant that the local sort of pest and disease pressure was quite low. So we farmers are never an island. We had to look around us and say, well, what will grow here, but what's the pest and disease pressure going to be like? There's a question at the back here.
You mentioned shortly about suppliers. Have you got any tips for any experience on that? Getting numbers of trees or scale?
Yeah, I mean there are not many farmers in the country. There are even fewer nurseries.
Order them now. Order them last week.
Yeah. I mean you've got to be thinking nearly 2 years ahead.
I mean, the other thing is potentially whilst we all might have a drive sometimes to do the whole project and plant the whole space all at once, sometimes little and regular planting helps you figure out what's going to actually survive and what's going to thrive. And then you also have the opportunity potentially of saving a bit of money by grafting some of your own stock, and particularly if you're then grafting from trees that are actually surviving in your area, your landscape, your climate, your soil type, it might help you work out what the best plant is for you.
Can I just add one thing just on that original question about markets, which is, don't forget that your own farm is potentially your first market. So, you could be growing your own fence posts or your own wood chip. There's lots of stuff that you could be growing to replace your own inputs before you have to go out and create or look for a market for another product. So not that obviously you can't do both, but...
Can I just add one point on the selecting the right tree, because I work with landowners rather than the tenants, so looking at the long term was not a problem. The thing that was important to us was to have multi-purpose trees, so you have many products from one tree. So nut trees fall into that category, and particularly walnut and hazelnut, because you start off with one idea about what your main product is, and then things turn up. So the squirrels decided that the fresh walnuts for the table. Maybe they weren't the best product, but the green nuts for pickling or green nuts for the Greek Cypriot sweet dessert, that was okay. So it's all accidents and learning from mistakes there. And then the latest figures on the payback year for walnut is year 7, and for hazel it's year 5. And then after that you are into some quite significant gross margins, but it's not instant. So, and again, the payback year depends on how much you're going to pay for the tree, because the dominant cost is the cost of the tree itself. For nuts, you need improved trees, not seedling trees. Again, if you can club together and have bigger orders, then you reduce the cost per tree. Shall we move on to another thing now?
There's some more questions.
Or do you want to carry? Any? Yeah. Yeah, so the most profitable tree at the moment is cricket-back willow. So that there's a lot of people doing that, and that's a classic agroforestry system, silver pastoral system, and that's very, very good returns. And you can carry on. You can combine it with stewardship and other benefits. But for timber, I mean, it's very sad because most of my trials are with ash, so we've been very worried recently. Again, you're looking there, waiting, about in the order of about 25 years, 30 years, and the best market is the Hurley sticks for the roots. But the other ones, oak and hybrid walnuts, this is a long-term thing. And again, if you can combine, you have a multi-purpose tree, so there are ways of getting walnuts and walnut timber at the same time from the same system.
I think there's a really important point that Ben made, which is, well, actually you've all made, which is about not doing, having options.
Yeah.
Especially with trees, what might be in vogue today might not be in vogue 20 or 30 years hence. And in fact, with climate change or diseases, people that have planted an awful lot of ash now, are looking into a sort of an empty bucket with cholera and ash dieback.
Yeah.
So spreading that risk, both in terms of market and disease and climate change, is quite important. From selecting the right tree, look at what's growing locally. Look in your hedgerows, look at what's growing, look at what's suitable to the local soil type. Select really good planting quality stock, because that's going to be massively important in terms of disease. You'd be surprised how much tree planting material comes from outside of the country that is imported, and there's some real questions around tree health and tree risk, and there's some new sort of DEFRA schemes about tree health and sort of trying to minimise disease.
No, I was just going to say, on forestry, you might also, in terms of multifunctionality, you could look at the multifunctionality of your design. So, for example, if you're looking at a silvopastoral system and you want to grow oak for timber purposes, which is a longer term crop, you might put that in a protected block. You might put the oak in the middle because it's a slower grower, and you might put something that's better for browsing around the outside. And then you're providing the browse for your livestock, but also it's helping shade the oak as a young tree, which will hopefully encourage you to give you that long straight stem, and so you might be able to approach a timber plantation by looking at that kind of stages of design, and then you can always thin out those trees when later on when the oak's going to be big enough to resist the livestock pressure, and think about your multifunctionality in terms of your design that way.
Yeah,
so that's a good lead into the next topic.
Well, I was just going to mention one other thing, because we have put in a few timber trees at our farm, but one of the ones we've looked at is World Service, which, when I looked into it, seems to thrive in a sort of lighter, sort of semi-shade thing. So it actually might do quite well in an agroforestry system. I mean, it's quite a small market, I think, sort of, musical instruments and things, but it's just something that might particularly suit an agroforestry system.
Shall we move on to the next topic? Planting and managing for survival. So with trees in agroforestry, it's a very different situation to trees in forestry. or has special challenges and special advantages? Who wants to talk?
Yeah, I think that was mine. I've killed a lot of trees. So the site we've got is mostly heavy clay, which is not easy to plant into. So we thought, well, we'll make it a bit easier to plant into it by taking a subsoiler and, digging a little strip through that we can plant into, which worked really well, and it made planting much quicker. And they seemed to establish quite well. And this was in 2018 when we had the drought, and the trench that we'd created just split open, and we had probably about 1.5 meter crack in the soil. And this poor little sort of twig is sitting there going, I've got nowhere to grow. So I don't think necessarily that we wouldn't create a slit again, because it was so much quicker to plant, and it gave you a straight line. We had a GPS track to do it for us, so I didn't have to spend hours marking out straight lines. But I think what I'd do next time is I would plant about 6 inches to one side of the crack, so you're not directly in it. And the other thing we found out was the trees that we mulched, so we used quite a lot of wood chip for mulching when we're establishing trees. The ones that we mulched mostly survived, and the ones that we got in January mostly survived. The ones that we didn't get until the beginning of March mostly died. So even just having an extra couple of months seemed to make a real difference to establishment, and mulching made a massive difference to establishment. The other thing that we've had some experience with is mulch mats, which I hate and would never use again. For us anyway, they created this perfect habitat for voles. Nice little, cosy roof, and if you then mulch on top of that, it's an insulated cosy roof, so just perfect.
Thatch roof.
Exactly. Whereas when we just use wood chip directly on the soil, I don't know if it's that it falls into their runs and they don't like it, but we tend not to get problems with voles where we've just got the wood chip mulch, but we definitely did where we had the mulch mats. So yeah, those are a couple of things we've learned.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. If you didn't hear it, it was about whether we'd have seen the same results in different years with a different climate. And I think you're right. It was definitely exacerbated in that year. I mean, I've actually got a really striking example where we'd thrown some mulch over a hedge with the intention of moving it. So there was some trees that had about 2.5 feet of mulch, and others had none. And the ones that had the mulch are now about 9 feet tall, and the other ones are there, and they're literally next door to each other. In subsequent years, we haven't seen the same problems, but I think even, every year now we seem to have a drought for a month or two, so even if you get plenty of rain, I think, I'd rather spend the time doing it. I think it was a particularly extreme case. I mean, we lost about 60% of what we planted that year, so it was quite severe.
Ben, is it worth reflecting on guarding? Because I remember when we were guarding ours, and I'd done little dots all over the field, and you had really nice straight rows, thinking, why wasn't I like Ben? Like one straight row, little bit of fence line, posts, whereas we were messing around with all kinds of different kind of metal guards for individual trees, constructing timber guards, sheep stock, cactus protectors.
Yeah, we'd spend a lot of time talking about fencing. It's all cost versus risk, really. It's the value of the tree. It's the number of trees you've got in any particular field. So one field we've deer fenced because we got quite a lot of expensive fruit and nut trees, and we just decided it was worth deer fencing the whole lot. In the other one, we've got single strand mains electric wire down each side of the row. And then because we've got hares and muntjac, we then have to do a little guard on the tree as well, but it's still cheaper. And we figure, we can lose quite a few trees before we have to start spending sort of 30 grand fencing a field. So it's weighing up, how the trees are planted. So straight lines, obviously, relatively easy to fence down each side. If you've got clumps of trees, you're probably better off doing them differently, or individual trees. But it's, how much can you risk losing that tree? And if you spent 50p on a seedling and a quid on a guard, you can probably afford to lose quite a few. If you spent 25 quid on a tree and you're not going to get a crop from it for 10 years, then you really want to make sure it survives.
So we made plenty of mistakes as well, actually. I guess for us, the fruit trees were nearly the cheapest part of the planting. The post and the tie and the guard and the mulch mat all added up to more than the cost of the tree. And my lessons there are buy good quality posts, because the stuff we bought was crap. We bought on a budget from sort of, I don't know, Scandinavian, what should have been treated, but clearly had been past the treatment plant on a lorry rather than spend any time there, because after 3 years it all rotten out of the base and you have to spend the money again. So that was a big challenge. Second one, mulch mat, same experiences. Put a mulch mat under 4,500 trees and you create this lovely little dry, warm environment for voles to then eat the base of the tree out. Worse still, when you come and mow that strip later on to regenerate pollen-bearing plants, it's amazing how many bearings you have to replace on a mower when you pick up these mulch mats and they wrap around the bearings. So that's not so good. The one thing we hadn't anticipated by taking arable fields and creating 125 acres of agroforestry is we hadn't anticipated creating 4,500 roosting posts for pigeons. And when one pigeon comes along and lands on your tree, which is this high, and it's a 2-year-old whip, that's not a problem. When two of his mates come and give him company, and 1,000 trees out of 4,500, so 25% have been broken, it starts focusing your mind. So we've solved that by actually going back in and putting a 10-foot bamboo cane with every tree, and then the pigeons would land on the top of the bamboo cane. Now it's not a problem because the trees are big enough. A further lesson would be think about not only the tree but what you're doing underneath the tree. So we experimented, put about 6 different sort of, well, we've got the demonstrations right behind you, but we put a sort of pollen nectar bearing species under the trees. Some have done really well, some haven't have done so well, some have changed over time. So you need to figure out what are the right sort of understory mixtures that are going to survive well under trees, and how you're going to manage that understory, whether that's going to be sprayed or cut and mulched or grazed or whatever. And I think one regret for me is I should have put a weather station in day one, because I know that we've seen massive microclimate changes over the last decade, but we benchmarked a lot of things, but the one thing we didn't do was put a weather station in that field. And I know that we've got wind reduction, and I know we've got warmer climates, and I know we've got better crop yields, but I haven't got the back data on that now, which I wish I had.
I would agree with you about post, Steve, but actually I think some of my favourite tree guards we put in using really good posts and then random bits of pallet or leftover bits of wire that we had lying around the farmyard. So we bought decent posts and then used just bits of pallet or something to block off to stop the stock getting to the trees themselves, and that was a relatively kind of cost-efficient approach to fencing in individual trees. And instead of putting in the bamboo poles, we put in one really big pole as a raptor post, so there was something in there to hunt all the pigeons. But Steve, do you want to pick up on this and take us into harvesting and marketing?
Yeah, so let's move on to the next topic. So harvesting, that's very important, and I'm living in Kent at the moment. We have a big problem with pickers, trying to get enough pickers. So all the systems we're designing now for the nut trees are mechanical harvesting. So that means changing the variety of the hazelnuts, so they're free husking nuts. When you shake the tree, the hazelnuts come down, ready to be swept up. Similarly with walnuts, trying to get them so when we shake them, they'll fall to the ground and picked up. So if you're doing things on a big scale, you need to think about designing for mechanical harvesting. Again, the spatial arrangement is taking into account the size of the sweeper for the nuts. So that's the harvesting. You think very carefully about that, whether you've got the labour, whether you want to involve labour, and it could be a community thing where labour's not a problem, and you could be have a community orchard, and people are happy to do that. So you need to think about that in advance. Now the markets. Well, luckily now we've got the internet, so you can look at what other people are doing, what prices they're getting, and find out what volumes are being sold. Basically, the agroforestry, it should be viewed as markets. It's an English product, or Welsh or Scottish. We're never going to compete on the world market for things because of our labour costs and our standards. So we need to be adding value. So the hazelnut oil in Kent now is got beginning to get a global reputation. We're exporting it to China, would you believe? Once word gets out, so I'm starting a project with lots of mulberries. The brewers have heard about it. They want mulberries for the beer. You need to spread the word. Look on the internet. There's a site called Alibaba, which you can look at what the world, what's the world prices, what different qualities of mulberry, walnut, and hazel. But we're looking at very high value crops. So the price per kilo for walnut, we're looking at about £10 a kilo or £15 a kilo, and that's the base price. Then you can start adding value onto it by selling the oils, the pickles, a whole range of products. And with the apples, Steve will tell us a bit more about that. Cider, there's a good market for that, and I remember doing work for the big cider producers looking at agroforestry, and the market was so good that they were willing to accept a payback year of year 14 for a commercial cider orchard.
I think that might be a bit different at the moment.
Yeah, so things change. That's an important point. But do you want to contribute on that?
Yeah, no. So just to give you sort of markets and figures. So our fruit trees are managed organically as part of an organic farm, which actually suits quite well because they're quite sort of easy care, for want of a better word. Harvested by hand. Bear in mind, it's not just the harvesting labour. You've got to organise. You've got to harvest organise the pruning labour, whether it's summer pruning or
packing and grading,
winter pruning. If we sell wholesale, they're about 28 pence a kilo, £280 a tonne. At 4 tonne a hectare yield, which is pretty low, it's fairly comparable to output from a sort of organic cereal crop. By juicing it and putting it in a bottle, where there's a cost, but you can pretty much quadruple its value by doing that. So you're turning it into £3 a bottle for 750 millilitres. So you're turning something that was £280 a tonne into sort of £1,200 a tonne, giving it quite a lot more value.
If you just run over, I'm about 100 acres of agroforestry of some sort. I'm trying to decide what. The cider's probably the easiest outlet for me down in Cornwall. Can you give me a little bit more idea about the figures and which fruits you would choose to plant?
So, roughly speaking, it's going to cost you around £5 to £7 per tree to put it in the ground if it's a fruit tree. By the time you've taken your mulch system, your garden, your tie, and a planting stake and the tree itself, you're probably not going to get in any yield for about 5 years, maybe a bit sooner down in Cornwall, a bit warmer. And then yields will start quite low and probably peak after about sort of year 7 or 8. You'll start getting into some decent yields. You should be looking at least sort of 5 tonne a hectare, but that could be easily up to sort of 20 tonne a hectare if you're managing them quite intensively. And wholesale value is about 28 pence a kilo, £280 a tonne on fruit at the moment.
Well, on cider fruit, it's almost nothing. I would really caution against going to cider at the moment. Not that it might not change, but the bottom's dropped right out of it. There's a lot of cider orchards being grubbed out. So I'm not saying don't do it. If you're looking at producing your own cider, creating a local market, that's one thing. If you're looking to wholesale into the cider market, I'd plant something else probably at the moment. But that might change.
What about nuts? Would nuts be where's the market in that place? There's loads of cider orchards in the West Country. What about nuts? Where do they go?
Well, there's local seasonal markets. People, if you taste an English walnut that's been dried properly compared to what you get in the supermarket, it's unbelievable. And a fresh walnut, so nutritious. You know, it's for half the population, it's cholesterol reducing. You've got all the essential fatty acids, and if you have a freshly picked walnut, it's beautiful. It's not bitter. You know, these things are really attractive. You can get people come into the farm. But another thing to think is about being innovative, you know, and looking at the trends. So there's been globally, there's been a 20% increase in nut consumption over the past 7 years. Now that is absolutely massive. 20% might not sound very much, but in terms of food preference, that is a massive shift. So we need to get on to that. You know, nut milks are incredible potential. Be innovative and think about replacing carbon inefficient products. So the average loaf of bread costs, if you do life cycle analysis, that's 1 kilo of CO2 per loaf. So this is very interesting. This is acorn flour. During the lockdown, I've been doing Newman's lockdown loaves on my street, and I make acorn bread, and it's absolutely delicious. It's mixed with some sort of stone ground flour, sourdough recipe. But this is carbon negative bread. So you need to think outside the box. So to come back to your timber question, well, let's look at oak again. So we're selecting for precocity. You know, we want which species will give us the acorns in year 3 or 5. Could we graft them to speed it up? And what's the timber going to be like? Because it's a multi-purpose thing. So you need to be innovative. You know, you need to think about products that will have a special label. And trees give you that opportunity. There's at least 60 different products you can get from a walnut tree. Do you want to add anything?
No, I was just going to say, before we move on to the next topic, I think the one thing we haven't talked about in terms of harvesting and marketing is the impact of harvesting in terms of the crop in between the trees.
Yeah, good point.
So when we were looking at our silvo arable system, for example, we looked at when we were going to be taking the cut from the arable part of our field, and then when we would need to be out with heavy machinery harvesting the trees. So we tried to design the whole system with that in mind. And for example, the elderflower we put in, which is obviously harvested usually in May, June, but was still part of a silvo arable system, what we worked in was we put in a wider margin around those trees, between those trees and the arable crop, so we would still be able to get in and harvest the elderflower without it having a detrimental impact on the crop in between. But I just wanted to flag before we moved on that don't just think about harvesting your trees you're growing, think about the impact of your harvesting and management of the crops in between the trees. But who was next? Or was that question at the back? In the man in blue.
Two questions.
2 questions.
So how do you, when you're evaluating potential agroforestry scheme, how do you take into account the risk of not knowing what the price of the product will be in 5 years, 10 years of time it takes to get to the point of harvest? Do you have an approach in terms of discounting risk factor?
So the question, if anybody didn't hear it, was how do you take into consideration the risk of not knowing the price of what your tree crop will be in 7, 8, 10 years' time when it comes to harvest? Steve?
So we use spreadsheets to do the model. So we look at what's the average price, and then we say, well, I don't believe that. So what happens if I get a tenth of the price? You can model it. So I said that the payback year was year 7 for walnut, hazel 5. Well, what if it's not? So you just model it and look at the consequence. But how you perceive the opportunity cost of time is quite difficult. So whether you want to use internal rate of return or net present value to offset that, you can do. But I find most farmers are not used to that. They'll just say, how long is it going to take and what kind of bonus, So I remember the cider growers in Herefordshire, they'd look forward to these big years where they could pay all the school fees and everything like that. So their perceptions of time, every farmer's perception's a little bit different. Whereas in the forestry world, we do this discounted cash flow approach, but the farmers I've spoken to, they don't do that kind of thing.
There's a really important consideration with regard to risk as it pertains to agroforestry, is that in most systems of agroforestry, probably you're only going to have about between 8 and 12% of the land area occupied by trees.
Oh,
So,
yeah.
so 90+% or around 90% of the land area is going to be doing something else anyhow. So you are spreading your risk in terms of product and marketing and land use quite considerably across that. It's a risk minimisation strategy. It's not all trees, it's not all crop. Just having that risk spread means that if the market does go up or down, you can buffer against that a bit.
I think the other thing as well is that tree is doing other things in your system than just giving you that cash crop. So if you've got livestock, it's sheltering the livestock, shading the livestock. If you've got a crop in between, it might be raising the temperature in between the rows. So it's quite hard when you start trying to work out the finance of agroforestry systems to really understand where all of that benefit's coming from. But it does take the pressure off that, if I was just planting an orchard of nuts, they have to produce. If those nut trees are also doing other things, it takes that away.
Yeah, on that note, so recent work on potatoes has shown that you can shade potatoes 27% without affecting the yield. So that's quite a lucrative crop, early potatoes. Early potatoes can be, growing and getting a crop before walnuts even in leaf. So you're spreading the resource use in time. It's about looking at that. And then carrying it even further. In my shade trials with parsley, I couldn't shade them enough. They didn't read the textbook. The more I shaded them, the bigger the crop was. And our work in India with a poplar, we were growing patchouli for the oil and roses for the oil, and various mint species, and tea. And the more you shade them, the quality goes up and the price goes up. So this is the magic thing about agroforestry. You're not just doing one thing. And once you understand the ecological combining ability, then you can really crank things up.
There was another question.
Another question.
Did you want to jump in on that one? Or did you want to jump in on that one?
Shall we have another
just-
question? Yeah,
sorry, Steve, just the other thing I was going to say on this, I think this builds on the point that Ben made. I watched a really interesting presentation recently from Wales where they were looking at identifying where you should plant trees based on your agricultural land classification. And one of the things they did is they took the agricultural land classifications, which I'm assuming most of the people in this audience are familiar with, but basically your grades about how good land it is for growing, and they ran them against the UK climate impact scenarios. And basically what they found out is that by the 2080 climate scenarios, most of the top agricultural grade land was down at like a kind of 4-3B level because of the impacts of climate change. So I think if we're talking about risks, then one of the things that introducing trees into your system do is they really help you manage the risk of unpredictable weather and the impact that could have on your other crops. And that's true for arable crops and it's true for livestock and livestock health.
Certainly on that, from our own experience, to give an example, from my own farm, we had some big storms in 2019, in the middle of August, and all the grain crops were fit and ready for harvest. So there was a lot of threshing going on in the sort of 3 days of 60-mile-an-hour winds. We lost about 20% of the grain onto the ground in the open fields. We lost 10% of the grain in the agroforestry fields because we'd slowed down the wind at ground speed, and therefore there wasn't that threshing going on. And that was a massive increase in terms of productive output and obviously risk minimisation by having those in place.
Another way of reducing the risks is to go and travel. Hopefully, so the figures are. I don't know whether we believe these figures, but they now say there is 500,000 hectares of agroforestry in the UK now. The Climate Change Committee.
You could be very socially distanced when you're travelling.
Yeah, and further afield, you can look at about 5 million hectares of agroforestry in the Iberian Peninsula. Go and see what they're doing with oaks, amazing things and high-value foods. Mechanised agroforestry in China, about 1.3 million. And in India, the mechanised poplar agroforestry is now 17 million hectares. So these are big things, and they've got some very interesting things, all applicable to us because a lot of those crops can be grown in this country.
I think there was a man in the red here that,
Yeah.
yes.
And in the middle.
Kill the right tree and also predicting what the price will be in 10 years' time. Would it not be wise to consider planting other trees now, like neem trees or eucalyptus or something, especially with climate change as well?
Very good point. Yeah.
We got almond trees in North Wiltshire. Bit speculative.
Olives in Hertfordshire, perhaps. Yeah, but I think it's a very good point. You know, if we
good
think as
point.
farmers, it's a challenge to worry about what the climate's going to do next season when we plant an annual crop. Planting something that might not be ready to harvest for 20 or 30 plus years, that's a big punt, and people are starting to think about actually with the impacts of climate change, we might be able to grow stuff here in southern England that we perhaps can't grow currently, but we would suit in the future.
And with carbon sequestration payments, so eucalyptus is a possibility, and then also paolonia. These are incredibly productive trees, and you'd be looking at harvesting them after about 5 years, 5-year coppice cycle, something like that. So definitely look at different species.
With 15 minutes to go, was that a good link into long-term tenancy issues?
Okay, great.
Or shall we take another question?
Oh, yeah. So this lady has been.
Yeah, so obviously the carbon is a marketable product as well in those trees. Have you guys done carbon calculations on your farm, how the trees planted improve that? Also how you could sell the credits of getting to carbon neutral and all that kind of stuff?
So there has been across globally and European-wise, there has been quite a bit of work on carbon building and sequestration with agroforestry. I should say there's been very little done here in the UK. And depending whether it's a fast-growing species or a slow-growing species and the density, the ranges are between sort of 1 and 4.5 tonnes of carbon equivalent per hectare around. We'll come on to policy in a bit, but there is already an established carbon trading market under the Woodland Carbon Code for forestry, and there is an emerging, as many of you will be hearing these 2 days, an emerging carbon trading framework for agriculture. Of course, agroforestry is a hybrid system. It's not forestry and it's not agriculture, so where does it sit? And the answer is it sits a bit uneasily in both of those. As we speak, we've been working with the Forest Canopy Foundation and also Grown in Britain as a third-party certification program to actually provide a carbon income for agroforestry of all types and sizes. So that'll be coming to the market, within the next few months. So there will be opportunities to get not only income from trees, from tree products, but also from a carbon market by doing agroforestry, which again will help spread the risk of establishment.
And any other questions? Okay, shall we move on to the next topic?
Tenancies.
So tenancy, yeah. There was a question about land ownership and tenancy, and bearing in mind about 32% of the land area in the UK is tenanted as opposed to owned. If you're a landowner, clearly investing in trees or agroforestry, it's a long-term asset which you can draw on. As a tenant, a bit more difficult because your tenancy arrangements might not outlive the length of the trees. My landlord, when we proposed putting an agroforestry system in, only asked 2 questions really. One is, how do I re-let the farm if you leave? And the second question was, isn't it going to bugger up the drainage system? Both quite valid questions. So the first question we answered by signing a document saying, if we leave, we have to take the trees with us. So at worst, I've got a wood fuel business, but I was prepared to take that risk with the tenancy. What it actually has allowed us to do is employ more people on the farm because there's a greater sort of work spread pattern, and also I'm trying to make the farm so complicated they can't let it to anybody else. But there's an important point here, is that as a farmer I'm charged rent on a 2-dimensional basis, on a per hectare basis. I can make the farm bigger in effect by farming in a 3-dimensional way and making it more productive, but that doesn't affect the rent at all. So that was the first thing, and the second thing was really about drainage, and I found a nice piece of work from a colleague of Steve's in Canada, where they've been doing work on drainage systems, and provided you maintain the drains properly and they're jetted and rodded, trees aren't looking for water in the middle of summer in the same way that, in the middle of winter in the same way that crops are. They've gone dormant. So when the drains are running dry in the summer, they don't go looking for water in drains and they leave them alone. So drain maintenance is a really important bit, but probably not a good idea to plant willow on fields with under drainage. But it's about right tree in the right place, really.
So at Dartington, we came at this from a landowner perspective, but what we did was quite novel. So having gone hunting for people that wanted tree crops, actually in the end we also just turfed all responsibility for growing them onto them as well. So what we did is the estate owned the land. We had a tenant who had the FBT for the entirety of the field, and then we used the grand tradition of licenses to license each of the tree growers for just the row that they were growing trees on. So our tenant paid rent to us, and the people that were licensing rows to grow trees on his field paid rent to him, and that was a sort of nice system that worked quite well. Legally quite an interesting system to uphold. So obviously with our main tenant who had the whole of the field, we had an FBT, but with licenses for tree growing, one of the issues was that for the first kind of 7 or 8 years, the tree growers would be investing really heavily into getting those trees into productivity, all of those upfront costs around establishment, and they were concerned that when they finally were productive, we'd just turf them out and keep the crops for ourselves. So into the license agreement, we wrote that basically the cost of moving them on would appreciate for the first 8 years as the trees established, and then once the trees start to harvest and they were getting their money back, then we would start to see a kind of depreciation of the value of those trees in terms of if we wanted to move them on from those spaces, from those rows. And then as the landowner, what we did was underwrite the license between our farm business tenant and the people that were growing the trees on license, so that if our farm business tenant changed, the people growing the trees still had security. I personally think this is a brilliant system, because you've got lots of farmers out there in the world who are very skilled at what they're doing, like with it, livestock or arable, who don't necessarily know much about trees, and they might want to learn, but they might not. But alternatively, your gentleman over there who's got his, arable field or something in Cornwall, for example, could find that there's somebody out there who doesn't have land, but is an expert grower of mulberries, for example, and just needs space to do it on. And actually, then you could combine the two. You both have workable businesses. You're both kind of helping each other in the same growing space, and you can both save on your rent by working collaboratively. So I'm a big fan of that approach, not just because I came up with it.
It does lead quite well into sort of nearly the last topic, which is that increasingly government are asking us to have sort of public goods and multi-outputs from land. But if you want multifunctional land use, which is what we're talking about with agroforestry, you actually need multi-skills. You need multi-operators. So layering not only an agricultural and forestry element to the land use, but layering the skill base and the labour force, having different people doing different things, is entirely sensible. One of the challenges at the moment, it doesn't fit neatly into the pigeonholes that our erstwhile political and DEFRA leaders sort of operate. They want one person, one holding. Well, sorry, life isn't like that. They're going to have to adapt their models as well.
Yeah, I mean, I do think the opportunities that are coming about because of agroforestry farming is really exciting. So the farm I'm at, I mean, it's part of a large rented farm, but Helen, the owner, actually owns the bit that we're doing the agroforestry on. So the Church of England weren't very keen for her to plant trees all over the main farm, but when she sort of inherited this bit, she started planting trees. And what had previously just been effectively fields with sheep on, now we're employing, she employs me part-time, she employs another person part-time. We're looking for someone to run poultry enterprises. There'll be, once the timber trees start kicking out, there'll be employment. So what was effectively, one person coming and checking some sheep a couple of times a day has become, it's become a hub, a community hub, and there's more employment will come. So I think, for people that don't have land, there's a real opportunity to approach, I think, farmers with ideas for crops and how you're going to manage them. And for farmers that don't have the skills of growing trees but want them, there's an opportunity to bring other people in to do it. But
sort of man hours is around trees.
how long is this particular piece of string? So how many man hours? It was the question. I mean, I think it depends partly on what trees you grow, on what you're doing with them. So if you're processing and making apple juice, so there's a planting and establishment cost, there's a pruning cost, and for different trees that will be different. There's a weeding cost, so even where we've got a good wood chip mulch, for instance, that doesn't control perennial weeds very well, so you still get your docks and thistles coming up, so you still have to go back occasionally and trim or do something to control them. Year 1 or 2, so 2018, we did water quite a lot of the trees that were nearer the barns, so there was a watering cost to try and keep them alive. So potentially all of that gets quite expensive. Then a picking cost, well, that depends on what you're picking. So we've got a fair amount of soft fruit in between our nut and fruit trees, and soft fruit takes forever to pick. So have you got a market for that, and have you got the labour at the right time, because it's quite short. So all of that gets quite complicated, and you need to think about all of that. So our market at Eastbrook is mainly the pub in the village, which is also run by Helen. But so we've got a market. It's half a mile down the road, but we still got to find people to pick them. And actually, the rest of the agroforestry project at the moment doesn't require labour all year round. So you're trying to fit. If you've got a farm team that you can fit different bits of labour in, that really helps. It's all about sort of juggling that and working out which trees and which crops fit with your system, I guess. But
Any questions? Yeah.
We are just embarked on a small business now. The landlord employs a land agent who is very much locked into conventional agriculture and is strongly resisting us planting the trees. Are there any facts and figures that say that we're not planting?
Well, I think those conversations with landlords and their agents, you have to explore things with them. But the agroforestry handbook would be a good place to start, and I would encourage you to try and take them to other farms that are doing agroforestry, because quite often the resistance is around a lack of understanding. And that lack of understanding often comes from just not having ever seen it. And I think once people see agroforestry, the light bulbs come on, and they get it. Well, it should be. I mean, I should be asking my landlord for some improvements, but that's going to be an interesting conversation. Agroforestry handbook, and then go and put them in a car or in a separate car and take them to see some agroforestry sites wherever you are. Come and talk to us afterwards.
Or hook them up with some agents that have already been part of, we for example kind of ditched our slightly more mature senior agent in favour for his junior agent, because his mind was a little bit more open, and so I'm sure people could introduce you to agents who've already done these schemes that he could talk to, and it might help to talk to somebody in the same profession as him.
Yeah. And absolutely. Yeah, we're hoping to do a couple of farm walks this summer, so, and the handbook's available to download from the Soil Association website.
Free of charge.
Do you have a way of applying the mulch to your trees? Is one question, and an easy way of doing it. And the other question is the medical benefits of trees. Which trees have what benefits without too long?
That second one is a massive. We're going to do a whole session on that. But I can quickly answer the other one. So it depends a little bit on the planting system. So we've got some trees that are narrower spacing and some that are wider. On the wider one, we used a feed wagon, and as long as the chip is consistent. So the chip that we did ourselves, where we were confident that it was all the same size, went through like a dream. We sort of adapted it and just put an extra bit on the side, so because we'd already fenced it by then. So it then went over the fence and in, and that worked really well. Where we're using wood chip that the tree surgeons have dropped off, it's a lot more variable, and there's occasional kind of weird stuff like tree sort, helmets and bags of rubble and stuff. And the farm manager wasn't going to let that go anywhere near his feed wagon. So we do also use a trailer and forks, but But even where, and it is expensive putting it on, even using, I mean, you can get specialised, there is specialised machinery for applying mulch. It's quite expensive, sort of 15, 20 grand. So you need to be doing a lot of trees to justify that. They're more for orchards. But even where you're doing it by hand and it seems very expensive, there's some really good research from America by a chap called David Granatstein looking at the economics of different mulching strategies. All of this, by the way, will be available in my book in woodchip, out in November. But the stuff from David is available online, and he looked at things like flame weeding, herbicides, tillage, and all of that stuff. And even though the mulch was one of the most expensive things to put down, the increased yield from the trees, because of the increased biology and soil health, outweighed that cost. So and certainly the work I've seen from our trees, the establishment is so much better that it is worth the expense, but it's not cheap.
Just want to hand over to Steve to say something on.
I was going to say, we've only got 1 minute to go, but on the animal health thing, Dr. Lindsay Wistance at the Organic Research Centre is probably one of the leading people for animal health and nutrition benefits of agroforestry, and they're running a trial, an elms testing trial in partnership with the Woodland Trust. So, and I can also put you to links onto the Dartington website under our silver pastoral thing. But Steve.
So to finish up, in this brave new world that we're in agriculture, you'll all be aware of the testing trials under the new Elms programme. There is active now, there is a testing trial on agroforestry, which many of us are involved with. And if you have an interest in agroforestry and you want to get involved as a stakeholder in this testing trial to determine what support you need, and perhaps that's advice, but also in terms of financial and payment, do go onto the Organic Research Centre website. There's a link on there for the agroforestry testing trial. You can register your interest, and we can keep you informed about the workshops that are going to be happening this sort of late summer and into the autumn, so that we can help shape how agroforestry will be supported under the new Elms programme. And just really to finish and say, 20 years ago, everyone thought agroforestry was barking mad. 10 years ago, there was a bit of interest. We managed to get a bit of change at a European level in terms of policy. As of December last year, DEFRA actually published on their website how they perceive agroforestry to be and how it's eligible with basic farm payment and with land use. So there's been a massive sea change in terms of the perception, but also the reality of how agroforestry could be operated on farms. And I think there's a really bright future for how it can be used in UK farms.
Okay.
Can I just quickly? Yeah. Sorry, just very quickly to remind you about the sheets on the seats. So if you do want to keep in touch on the agroforestry, fill one of those in. Also, if you are planting some agroforestry and sort of at the beginning of that journey, it'd be really good to hear from you as part of the Innovative Farmers Programme, and possibly getting involved in a field lab on that. We've got a separate Innovative Farmers tent, so do shoot along there and sort of register interest about doing an agroforestry field lab.
The Farm Woodland Forum is also an invaluable resource. There's a shared email thing. People ask all sorts of questions, and people like Steve and Ben and Steve answer them, which is very helpful.
So it just remains to be said, thank you all for your amazing questions, and look forward to the future of seeing more trees.